Admiral Catherine Hayes didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice, didn't throw her mug, didn't even blink. But her tone low, steady, cold cut through the silence of the command room like a blade. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez stood stiffly in front of her desk, face pale, datapad trembling slightly in his grip. He'd been the one assigned to relay the initial casualty report. He hadn't expected to be the one giving this particular update. "They bombed our colonies," he said, swallowing hard. "New Sydney, Europa Base, Ganymede Station, all three, gone." Hayes lowered her coffee mug onto the table with deliberate calm. It clicked softly against the polished metal. She stared at the holomap hovering over her desk, now marked with 3 new red X. "How many dead? Preliminary count. Over 8 million. Hayes didn't move, didn't breathe. She just stared at the map, her expression unreadable. Rodriguez added, voice barely audible, "The Nexar claim it was a measured response. Their exact statement said, and I quote, 'Human expansion beyond your solar system is deemed excessive and threatening to galactic stability. This action is intended to deter further colonial ambitions.'" Silence. Hayes finally spoke, almost to herself. "Measured." She stood, straightened her uniform jacket, and walked to the massive window overlooking Earth's orbit. The blue curve of the planet shimmered below, dotted with the gleaming forms of Terran Defense Fleet ships. "They actually used the word measured," she said again, a strange half-smile forming on her lips. "Fascinating choice." Rodriguez remained at attention, unsure if he should speak again. "Lieutenant," she said, not turning, "are you familiar with the phrase, 'let sleeping dragons lie'?" He blinked. No ma'am. It's an old proverb. The meaning's simple. There are some forces you don't disturb unless you're absolutely certain you're ready for the consequences." She finally turned to face him, her eyes sharper than steel. "We've played the part of the peaceful neighbor for over a century. We've traded, we've talked, we've offered olive branches, not because we were weak, but because we remember what we're capable of when we stop trying to be nice." Rodriguez swallowed hard. He'd read the history books. He knew what humanity had done to itself during the world wars, the resource conflicts, the terraforming riots. He knew why the Terran Constitution had written restraint into the foundation of interstellar law. What the Nexar just did, Hayes continued, wasn't a military strike. It was a provocation. They wanted to remind us of our place, but all they've done is remind us of who we used to be, who we still are deep down. There was a beat of silence before she turned back to the map and tapped a command into the console. The red XS disappeared, replaced by blue glyphs. Emergency response protocols. War readiness alerts. We gave the galaxy every opportunity to believe we'd moved beyond our past. And now, they've chosen to forget why the first contact protocols gave Earth such a wide berth. We're about to remind them. Rodriguez shifted uneasily. "Admiral, are you suggesting a counteroffensive?" "I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "I'm informing you. The Nexar just woke the dragon, and now we burn." Far across the stars, deep in Nexar territory, panic was spreading. Senior tactician Raxival stood frozen in front of a tactical display, his sensory frills flattened in alarm. "What do you mean they're not retreating?" he barked at his junior analyst. "The humans," Tech Mora hesitated. "They're mobilizing, fully. All ships are being recalled to their home system. Civilian vessels are being retrofitted with combat-grade shielding and weapons. This doesn't match any of their expected response patterns." Raxival hissed in disbelief. "Our models predicted diplomatic overtures, a species-wide withdrawal. How could they?" "Perhaps," came a quiet voice from the rear of the room, "we should have paid more attention to the why." Both Nexar turned to the corner where Zindar, a cultural specialist, stood coiled and watching with unreadable eyes. "Explain," Raxival snapped. "Humanity didn't build their society on diplomacy because they couldn't fight," Zindar said. "They built it because they chose not to. Every piece of technology we've encountered has dual use. There's science, there's ships, Even their trade routes, everything is adaptable, weaponizable. They're post-atomic, Tex Mora said, uncertain. Their entire culture has been oriented away from conflict. Exactly, Zindar said. Oriented, not reprogrammed. Redirected. They have not forgotten how to fight. They've just been waiting for a reason. The command center fell silent. Then a flashing alert appeared on every console. Massive energy spikes originating from the Sol system. Thousands of warships. Not on any Nexar records. No known configurations. No identifiable propulsion specs. Raxival felt his blood chill. How many? Over 3,000 vessels of cruiser class or larger. And, Techmora paused, they're using our own recognition codes. Raxival's frills twitched wildly. How is that even possible? Because, Zindar said softly, they've been studying us the entire time, watching, listening, building vessels designed specifically to counter our tactics and tech. And we didn't even realize they were watching. The implications settled like a lead weight across the room. We thought we were containing them, Zinda continued. But we weren't. We were just poking the giant. And now, the dragon's awake. Back in orbit over Earth, the dreadnought Remembrance thrummed with energy. It had been listed as a research ship for nearly 30 years. A lie. A beautiful, intricate lie. Now, its armored hull shimmered with the activation of long-dormant systems. Missile arrays, quantum lances, phase disruption plating. Its crew stood at full readiness. Admiral Hayes strode onto the bridge. Status. All ships reporting ready, Admiral, said Commander Anjali Patel. Operation Wake-Up Call is green across the board. The Nexar still think their jamming systems are working. Hayes allowed herself a rare smile. They've mistaken our primitive radio systems for a lack of sophistication. In reality, we kept them functional for exactly this reason. Backup comms, broadcast capacity, psychological payloads. She turned to the fleet-wide comm system and opened a channel. All ships, this is Admiral Hayes. The Nexar thought they could teach us a lesson. Today, we teach them one in return. Her voice hardened. They chose to bomb our homes, our families, our children. They thought it would show us weakness. But instead, they've reminded us of the fire we keep hidden beneath the surface. She sat in her command chair, fingers poised over the jump command. Execute on my mark. And don't forget to broadcast the package. What package, ma'am? Patel asked. Hayes grinned. The one that reminds them why dragons don't give second warnings. 3, 2, 1. Mark. Outside the viewport, the fleet vanished in a synchronized ripple of light. And on every Nexar channel, a message began to play. We didn't build these ships because we wanted war. We built them because we remember what happens when someone makes us fight. You took 8 million lives to teach us our place. Now we'll teach you why dragons don't sleep lightly. The fleet reappeared on the edge of Nexar-controlled space, slipping out of quantum tunneling like predators emerging from mist. There was no fanfare, no warnings. Just the silent appearance of over 3,000 warships, hulking, sleek, and bristling with weaponry. Admiral Catherine Hayes stood at the command deck of the Remembrance, her face illuminated by the tactical displays. Around her, the bridge crew moved with the practiced calm of people who'd trained for this day their entire lives, even if they hadn't known it at the time. Status report, she said. All vessels holding position. Jamming systems are ineffective, as expected. Nexar border defenses have not yet responded, Commander Patel replied. Broadcast of the message is active on all channels. Hayes nodded once. She stared at the swirling icon of the Nexar's closest military outpost. They think this is our retaliation, she murmured. It's not, Patel asked. No, Hayes said. This is their education. The message continued looping across Nexar comms, translated into dozens of dialects. We don't fight because we enjoy it. We fight because we remember. We remember the wars that nearly ended us, the peace that cost us everything, the restraint that rebuilt our world. We remember what happens when dragons forget how to sleep. Years ago, humanity had been on the edge of self-destruction. The last global war had turned continents into ash fields, oceans into acidic soup, and economies into dust. For a time, people lived underground or in sealed arcologies, terrified of radiation storms, food collapse, or the next retaliatory strike. Cities died, billions vanished, nations crumbled. And then, somehow, they stopped. Humanity looked into the abyss and stepped back. In the centuries that followed, peace wasn't just declared. It was engineered, hard-coded into governments, education, culture. Conflict resolution became a core component of diplomatic training. Entire generations were raised with the belief that war was a failure of imagination. They'd become the diplomats of the stars, the curious explorers, the friendly traders, the quiet observers in galactic councils who rarely spoke first, but when they did, others listened. And yet, beneath that cultural renaissance, there was always something else. A memory, a whisper, a truth. Peace was never a result of weakness. It was a conscious choice. On the Nexar command station, Vraxi 4, Senior Tactician Raxi Val watched the live tactical feeds with something approaching disbelief. The human fleet hadn't attacked. They hadn't moved at all. But every sensor told the same story. Each of those warships was active, weapons charged, shields powered, formation perfect. Why are they just sitting there? He growled. Zindar, the Nexar cultural specialist, answered softly from across the room. Because they're giving us a chance to think. What kind of species does that? Tekmora muttered, glancing at the ever-looping broadcast. They could have struck already. They could have ended us already, Zindar corrected. They still might, but right now they're showing us what they are and what they aren't. Raxival turned, irritated. You've studied them. You tell me, why didn't they respond with immediate violence? Zindar's eyes darkened. Because they've been violent before, and it nearly ended them. What you're seeing out there, he gestured toward the screen, is what restraint looks like when built on top of power. Back aboard the Remembrance, Hayes sat with a steaming mug of black coffee, staring at the swirling stars. Rodriguez entered the room holding a fresh data pad. Report from Earth Command. Full fleet mobilization across all major sectors. Civilian engineering corps are ready to deploy for reconstruction efforts. She took the pad and skimmed it. They're scared, he added. The Nexar, every station, every outpost, they're sending distress signals to each other. Some are trying to evacuate. Hayes didn't smile. We could end them, Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper. We have the firepower. We have the intelligence. They wouldn't last an hour. Hayes looked at him. That's not the point. Then what is, ma'am? She leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. Every species out here has watched us for decades. They thought the reason we didn't wage war was because we couldn't, because we'd evolved past it, because we were soft. She shook her head. They were wrong. We didn't evolve past war. We remembered it. Rodriguez sat down across from her. Every peaceful treaty we signed, every cultural exchange, every time we bit our tongue instead of drawing a blade, she said, voice low and steady. That was a choice. Not because we lacked the strength, but because we remembered what strength without control looks like. She pointed toward the window, toward the stars. But the galaxy forgot. So now we remind them. The next day, the Nexar attempted to open diplomatic channels. Their first message was confused, nervous, a little desperate. Human High Command, the translation system rendered. We request clarification. Are you declaring war? Admiral Hayes responded with a calm, neutral transmission. We are offering an opportunity to make things right. You destroyed our colonies. You killed our civilians. You struck without cause. And yet, here we are talking. A long pause followed. Then another message. What do you want? Hayes didn't answer immediately. Instead, she uploaded a series of file scans of Nexar military designs, vulnerabilities, communication exploits, propulsion weaknesses, and biological susceptibilities. The Nexar High Command fell silent. The final line of the human message read, "This is 2% of what we know. The rest stays in our vaults, unless you make us open them. This is not a threat. This is a fact." In the days that followed, the Nexar agreed to every term. They would rebuild the destroyed colonies using their own resources. They would compensate the families of the victims. They would sign an accord acknowledging humanity's sovereignty beyond Sol, and never again interfere in its expansion. When asked why Earth wasn't demanding territory or tribute or even a military surrender, Admiral Hayes responded simply, "We're not here to conquer. We're here to build. But we won't let anyone destroy what we've built." Months later, the newly rebuilt New Sydney colony welcomed its first wave of settlers. Nexar construction ships hovered alongside human craft, their workers collaborating with quiet efficiency. The colony rose with a blend of Nexar bioarchitecture and human design, a symbol of something neither side could have imagined before the war that wasn't. And standing at the center of the colony's plaza was a sculpture, massive, graceful, unmistakable. A sleeping dragon, wings curled, eyes closed, but one claw resting on the hilt of a sword buried in the earth. A plaque at its base read, "Peace is a choice, not a weakness." Hayes stood in front of it, arms crossed, watching the workers move. Rodriguez stepped beside her. "The Nexar engineers said they wanted to make the statue," he said. "They did," she replied. "Why a dragon?" Hayes smiled faintly. "Because they finally understand." He looked at her. "We choose peace, Marcus," she said, "because we remember what happens when we don't." From the outside, it had always looked like diplomacy. Trade missions, scientific exchanges, cultural programs, peace conferences. Humanity had offered everything a young, idealistic spacefaring species could offer. Open hands, friendly smiles, and a deep curiosity about the galaxy and its peoples. But inside classified vaults on Earth, beneath the domes of Martian intelligence facilities and aboard hidden command centers, drifting through the asteroid belt, every smile had been recorded. Every smile had been recorded, every seemingly minor detail analyzed. Because while the galaxy had seen ambassadors, what it had actually met were scouts. Admiral Catherine Hayes watched the data streams pouring across the Remembrance's main tactical display. It was a storm of intel, decades of classified files now unsealed, cross-referenced and integrated into active threat profiles. The Nexar were the priority. Dozens of profiles had been compiled across years of peaceful engagement, recordings of how Nexar communications degraded under specific frequency interference, performance specs of their propulsion systems, known energy signatures of their cloaking attempts, biomeric data collected from diplomatic envoys to Earth. It wasn't spying, it was insurance. "Status on Project Firebreak?" Hayes asked. "Fully online," Rodriguez replied. "The data vaults are synced. Counter-strike protocols are preloaded into Fleet AI Nexar Command. Algorithms have been mapped and modeled." She nodded. "What about diplomatic simulations?" Patel stepped forward from the holodable. "We've run 50 scenarios. 87% predict full Nexar military collapse within 72 hours if we engage. The rest predict surrender within 5. "Not bad," Hayes murmured. There was no pride in her voice, no triumph, just preparation. Just the calm certainty of someone who knew this moment had been inevitable. It had started subtly, generations ago. A Terran diplomat noticed a Nexar trade ship took exactly 2.6 seconds longer to respond to coded messages during magnetic solar storms. A minor delay on paper, but someone flagged it. A week later, researchers at Europa's defense labs confirmed a vulnerability in Nexar comms under M-Flux. The data was stored, labeled, cross-checked. Years later, a human linguistics expert noticed a certain Nexar dialect used a redundant tense only in contexts of deception or concealment. That too was flagged. And over time, every detail, every quirk, Every inconsistency, every pattern was fed into Earth's predictive models, not to build weapons, but to know where to aim them if ever needed. Zindar, the Nexar cultural specialist, sat in stunned silence aboard his people's command station. "They've known all along," he whispered. Senior Tactician Raxival paced behind him, furious. "That's impossible. We scanned their trade fleets. We monitored their tech development. They were primitive." "No, they were quiet," Zindar corrected. "And we mistook that quiet for weakness." He pointed to the screen, where a fleet of human warships continued to hover in cold formation, perfectly spaced, perfectly coordinated. "They knew our jamming protocols," Zindar said. "Our sensor ranges. Even our encryption patterns." "How?" Tekmor asked, eyes wide. "Because they were watching. Every handshake, every treaty, every embassy visit. They weren't just exchanging pleasantries, they were studying us." Back aboard the Remembrance, Hayes reviewed the latest compilation from Earth Intelligence. Operation Dusk Mirror Subfile. Nexar Trade Mission 7, Behavioral Patterns Summary. Envoy responded with evasive body language when exposed to verbal aggression. Noted increased skin pigmentation under pressure. Vocal frequency shift indicates stress response time window, 4.2 seconds. Recommended tactic: rapid verbal escalation to force panic-induced negotiation missteps. Another entry: Operation Lantern Seed Subfile. Nexar Station Logistics. Maintenance Pattern Summary. Structural redundancies are overcompensated in living quarters, but under-engineered near power junctions. Suggest point of failure targeting at grid convergence nodes. It went on and on. Not threats, not sabotage, just knowledge. Quietly, relentlessly collected over decades. "You know what the most important part of this is?" Hayes asked, turning toward Patel and Rodriguez. They looked up. "It wasn't about the Nexar," she said. "It was about us, about making sure we never got surprised again." Rodriguez frowned. "You think it was about the first contact?" Hayes nodded. "When Earth made first contact 130 years ago, half the Council thought we'd be wiped out within a decade. So we built peace, but not naively." She looked back at the fleet outside. "We learned. We cataloged. We prepared. Because peace is only real if it's a choice. And choice means you need options." Elsewhere in the galaxy, species who had once dismissed humans as harmless now scrambled through their own archives. Had Earth gathered intelligence on them too? Were their own protocols compromised? The answer was yes. The diplomatic music festivals on Elysian Prime used to test crowd psychology in non-humanoid species. The joint agricultural program on Threxia covered biomapping of the Threxian atmospheric processors. The human-led art symposium on Vorthus 5, actually a field test of multisensory cognitive interference patterns. All filed away, not for exploitation, for defense. Just in case. 3 days after the human fleet appeared in Nexar space, the Nexar High Command requested a formal audience with Admiral Hayes. The call came through a secure relay, encrypted using protocols the humans had cracked 15 years ago. Hayes took the call in a sealed chamber aboard the Remembrance, surrounded by silent officers and recording AIs. Admiral Hayes came the Nexar Supreme Commander's voice. "We were unprepared for the extent of your military response." "We haven't responded yet," she corrected. "Then why are you here?" "To remind you," she said, "that every time we shook your hand, we were also watching which hand you kept behind your back." Silence. "You think we came to dominate you?" she continued. "We didn't. We came to understand you, because understanding is the first defense, and defense is what you forced us to prioritize." "You want war," the Nexar asked quietly. "No," Hayes replied. "We want peace, but we will not accept peace built on fear. We will accept only peace built on truth. And if we don't agree..." Hayes leaned forward slightly, her voice low and cold. "Then the files you've seen are just the beginning." The meeting ended without ceremony. An hour later, the Nexar sent unconditional surrender. But more than that, They sent something far rarer in galactic diplomacy, an apology. Weeks later, the human intelligence apparatus began declassifying parts of its long-hidden archives. Select sections were shared with Nexar advisors, under heavy oversight. At first, the aliens expected cruelty schemes, traps, deception. What they found instead was detail. Thousands of files showing years of analysis, all rooted in a single consistent truth. Humanity had never stopped preparing. Even as they extended friendship, they'd mapped escape routes. Even as they opened embassies, they'd built fallback protocols. Even as they shared knowledge, they'd recorded what wasn't said. Not because they were planning war, but because they couldn't afford to forget what war looked like. One of the Nexar analysts, after spending a week inside the Earth archives, made a quiet statement during a joint press conference. "We thought humanity had forgotten how to be dangerous. We now understand. They never forgot. They just hoped they wouldn't have to be." Hayes stood beside him. She didn't smile, but she nodded. That was enough. They had been patient. For generations, humans had walked carefully among the stars, smiling, trading, learning, earning trust. They hadn't come to conquer, and they made that clear from the beginning. They weren't the largest, the fastest, or the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy, but they were the most dangerous. Not because of their weapons, though those were formidable. Not because of their numbers, though those were growing. And not even because of their long memory, though that played a part. No, humanity was dangerous because of something else entirely. They believed they were right. "Clarity," Zindar said softly. The Nexar cultural specialist stood at the edge of the command platform, watching the human fleet hold its position like a clenched fist, ready, restrained, and unmoving. "Excuse me?" Raxival asked. Zindar's tendrils curled in a pattern of reflection. "That's what we gave them. Moral clarity. And we didn't even realize it." Raxival, who had once confidently overseen containment operations against human expansion, looked shaken. "We expected them to negotiate, to withdraw, even if they retaliated. We thought it would be calculated, limited." Zindar didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the screen. "They're not negotiating. They're not angry. They're not confused. They're focused." The human ships didn't drift. They didn't shift unnecessarily. They didn't speak unless they had something precise to say. Everything about them, their formation, their silence, their posture, spoke of absolute purpose. Zindar looked back at Raxival. "Do you know what happens when a species convinced of its moral superiority gains overwhelming justification?" Raxival shook his head. They stopped hesitating. On the Bridge of the Remembrance, Admiral Catherine Hayes read through the latest strategic assessment from Fleet Intelligence. It wasn't just about the Nexar anymore. Over the last 72 hours, 12 other species had issued revised threat levels for humanity. 5 had offered formal condolences for the destroyed colonies. 3 had publicly denounced the Nexar. And 4 had quietly asked for meetings with Terran diplomats, hoping to strengthen cooperation. Hayes closed the report and leaned back in her chair. "Funny thing," she said aloud, "not to anyone in particular. All it took was one act of cowardice to show them exactly who we are." Commander Patel glanced over. "It wasn't just cowardice, ma'am. It was cruelty, targeting civilians, children." Hayes nodded once. "And that gave us clarity." She remembered a different time decades ago, when she was still a junior officer. Back then, every mission came with a balancing act. How much could humans push without seeming threatening? How far could they expand without stepping on someone's sense of territory or superiority? She remembered long nights spent drafting statements so carefully worded they barely meant anything. She remembered being told to always appear humble, always let others speak first, always downplay Earth's capabilities. And then the Nexar had wiped out New Sydney. She remembered the image that came in on the emergency feed children's playground still burning, the broken spire of the colony's central council tower, civilian med ships shattered before they could even launch. That was the moment something in her, something in all of humanity snapped back into focus. In a high-level briefing 2 days later, Earth's president addressed the Global Assembly. Her words were brief, cold, precise. "We spent a century choosing peace. We will spend the next few days reminding the galaxy why that was a choice, and what it looks like when we choose differently." There was no applause, just grim nods and immediate action. In war rooms across Mars, old protocols were activated, programs written and shelved generations ago, deemed unnecessary until now. AI-piloted countermeasure fleets that had never been revealed. Deep space fallback catches lit up with energy signatures as they came online. Civilian ships were called home, not to hide, but to be armed. For every image of the burned colonies that reached the public, there was not chaos. No riots, no panic. There was unity. Recruitment offices overflowed. Military production accelerated without the need for conscription. Volunteer engineers began working double shifts to retrofit defensive systems across Earth's protectorates. The galactic net, long used for culture and diplomacy, now carried something else: raw, focused human resolve. Everywhere you looked, you saw it in their eyes' certainty. "They're not scared," Sindar said quietly, almost reverently. "They're sure." Tikmora stared at him, her frills rippling nervously. "But shouldn't that make them less dangerous?" Sindar shook his head. "Not humans. Not now. They don't just think they're right, they know they're right. And history shows us when humans believe their cause is just, they become unstoppable." In one of the emergency shelters beneath the ruins of Europa Base, a journalist recorded a survivor, an elderly woman named Amira Cho. Her home had been vaporized. Her son had been on a medical transport that never made it out, and yet her words carried something harder than grief. "They came here thinking we were soft," she said. "That because we traded bread instead of bullets. We were too afraid to bleed. But we remember what happened the last time someone tried to force humanity into submission. We ended that war with fire, and then we buried our weapons because we never wanted to use them again. They made us dig them back up. And now they'll see why we buried them in the first place." Admiral Hayes sat before the broadcast camera. Her voice transmitted across every human ship, and more importantly, onto open Nexar channels. "This isn't vengeance," she said. "This isn't conquest. This is clarity. We didn't want war. We don't need war, but we also don't hide from it. And we will not let anyone decide for us how far we're allowed to reach into the stars." Her tone shifted. "You made this simple. You took lives with no warning, no negotiation, no attempt at understanding. You made the decision for us, so now we make one for you. Effective immediately, the Terran Defense Force will maintain an active presence across all former Nexar border territories. We will oversee the rebuilding of our colonies on your credit. We will dismantle your command systems. We will audit your military archives." She paused, letting that sink in. "And then we will leave. But we will leave behind a warning, carved into every relay station and etched into every diplomatic protocol you share with others going forward." She looked directly into the camera. "Never mistake a sleeping dragon for a dead one. And never, ever, give it a reason to wake up." Later, in the quiet aftermath, as Nexar fleet stood down and human construction ships moved into position, a junior officer asked Hayes what had changed. "Why now?" he said. "Why this time? We've lost people before." Hayes didn't answer at first. She stared out at the stars, then turned and gave him the truth. "Because we didn't hesitate," she said. "Because for once, the choice was clear. No nuance, no gray, just wrong and right. And when humans see that kind of clarity," she added, "we stop debating. We stop compromising. We move." To the untrained eye, Earth's fleet had always looked modest. Freighters, research vessels, deep space colony transports. Shiny enough to look modern, simple enough to look harmless. They were sleek, well-maintained, efficient symbols of humanity's focus on trade, exploration, and peace. But under the polished hulls and solar sail banners was something else entirely. A weaponized lie. Inside the Remembrance's war room, Admiral Catherine Hayes stood with her arms folded, watching a projection of the so-called civilian fleet flicker across the tactical holotable. The system now displayed them not as transport ships or diplomatic cruisers, but as what they really were, warships in disguise. Retrofitted, reinforced, relentless. All vessels have completed full conversion, Commander Patel reported. Heat signatures have normalized. Weapons are calibrated, and FTL jump relays have synced across the grid. Visual scans, Hayes asked, still appear as civilian. Hull modulations holding. Even their ID beacons remain on military per galactic registry. Hayes gave a satisfied nod. Good. Let's keep the surprise a little longer. She turned back to the display, watching as the Gideons reach. A ship once labeled a cargo hauler now revealed twin rail cannons and an internal hangar housing 3 squadrons of autonomous strike drones. Next to it, the Solstice Harmony, a deep space exploration cruiser, ran a silent system diagnostic on its cloaked torpedo arrays. And then there was the Nomad Dawn, registered as a humanitarian relief ship, now fully armed with plasma interceptors and a classified AI combat module known only as Project Ghost Class. To the galaxy, they had looked like symbols of peace. They were always built for war. Years ago, when humanity first stepped into the interstellar arena, the prevailing belief was that Earth was fragile. A species newly risen from its own ashes, too scarred by self-inflicted wounds to pose a threat. Humans had encouraged that image. They leaned into the role of the humble diplomats, the curious scientists, the overly cautious newcomers. They arrived in lightly shielded transports, smiled a lot, and asked a lot of questions. But that wasn't fear. That wasn't weakness. It was camouflage. Admiral Hayes had been part of the original design committee for the Hidden Fleet project, back when it was still called the Contingency Framework Initiative. Its directive had been simple. Every vessel we send into deep space must be prepared to come back a warship. No one talked about it openly. There were no public votes, no grand announcements, just quiet funding shifts, black budget projects, and deeply buried development contracts. Engineers working on modular hull plating weren't told that their designs were meant to withstand kinetic bombardment. AI developers training logistics routines weren't told their code would eventually manage battlefield targeting matrices. And every civilian captain sent into deep space carried a secure data chip labeled only break glass if fired upon. When the Nexar attack came, the glass shattered. Across the stars, thousands of ships received the encrypted signal. The same 5 words appeared on every screen. Code black, convert, stand by, and then silently, the transformation began. The Odyssey Wines, stationed on the outer rim of the Varela Drift, had been hauling terraforming equipment for over a decade. Its captain, a second-generation colonialist, had never fired a shot in anger. But when the ship's backup systems came online, the crew watched in stunned silence as bulkheads slid away to reveal concealed weapon pods, automated turrets that had been dormant for 16 years. The internal lights shifted from blue to amber. The AI's voice changed tone. The nav system rerouted them not to their next drop-off, but to a pre-programmed rendezvous point. By the time the crew had fully suited up, the Odyssey Winds was no longer a terraforming ship. It was a heavy assault platform. And it wasn't alone. In every sector, the story repeated. Diplomatic envoys turned into forward command ships. Science vessels unfolded into artillery platforms. Even passenger liners revealed armored compartments, high-density energy shields, and launch bays for intercept drones hidden beneath their hulls. The Nexar had assumed Earth's reach was limited, that its fleets were few, that their attack would stall expansion. What they didn't know was that Earth's real fleet had been waiting in plain sight, scattered across space, hiding behind friendly faces and shipping manifests. And now, it was awake. Zindar reviewed the latest intel feed in stunned silence. They built an entire second fleet, he whispered, and no one noticed. Raxival's frills drooped in disbelief. That's not just preparation. That's obsession. No, Zinder replied slowly. That's paranoia. Carefully cultivated, patiently maintained, and now fully justified. He scrolled through image after image of ships that had never appeared on any Nexar registry. Ships that, for decades, had docked at Nexar ports, exchanged gifts, participated in goodwill tours. Each one had been mapped, scanned, and seemingly harmless. And yet here they were transformed into engines of war with a single signal. On the Remembrance, Hayes stood in front of the observation deck, hands clasped behind her back. Rodriguez approached. Fleet Command reports we now have 94% of the converted ships ready for full combat operations. What's the other 6? Still in retrofitting. Minor compatibility issues. Civilian crews adjusting. Volunteers? Volwa? Almost all of them. Many of the captains. They didn't hesitate. Some of them even activated their conversions before the signal reached them. Hayes nodded slowly. They were waiting for an excuse. Rodriguez looked out the viewport. Why hide all this? Why go through the trouble of disguising ships for decades? She didn't answer immediately. Then, because war was never the plan, it was the backup. She remembered something her grandfather once told her when she was a child, back when stories of Earth's old wars were still too fresh to be romanticized. It's not the swords you can see that worry me, he'd said. It's the ones you don't even know are there. The ones waiting in the dark, not to strike, but to make sure no one else ever does first. That was what humanity had become. A fleet of swords wrapped in silk. The galaxy was used to threats, bombast, shows of power, fireworks. Humanity had shown none of that. Instead, they had waited. They had watched. They had prepared. And when the time came, they didn't roar. They activated. In the final phase of Operation Wake Up Call, the Remembrance broadcast one last message to the Nexar and every species listening in. We built these ships not to fight, but to survive. We hid them not out of shame, but out of hope. Hope that we'd never need them. You took that hope from us. So now we show you what we built in its place. The message ended with the image of the Soul's Anvil, a vessel registered for deep space rescue, unfolding its armored plating and releasing 3 drone swarms, each painted with the insignia of Earth's old planetary defense forces. It had never rescued anyone. It had been waiting, just like the rest of them. They hadn't fired first. That detail would be remembered, recorded, inscribed in treaties and taught in classrooms across dozens of worlds. The Nexar had struck first without warning, without cause. They had vaporized cities, bombed civilians, burned settlements to ash. They had expected hesitation, retreat, diplomacy. What they got instead was a masterclass in how humans end wars. The Battle of the Nexar Rim didn't last days. It didn't drag out with political standoffs or slow-burning attrition. It lasted 6 hours. 2 hours for border defense annihilation. 2 hours to penetrate core systems. 2 hours to talk. Admiral Catherine Hayes watched the first phase of the operation unfold from the command deck of the Remembrance, her face lit by soft red status lights. The human fleet moved with terrifying coordination, every jump synchronized, every weapon precisely deployed, every maneuver drilled into perfection over decades of simulated training. Phase 1 complete, Commander Patel reported. Nexar outer defenses are down. Their early warning systems never triggered. 0 loss on our side. Any signs of counterattack? Minimal, disorganized. Their command structure wasn't ready for a full assault. They still think we're reacting, not executing. Hayes nodded once. Phase 2. Begins system penetration. The human fleet advanced like a scalpel through flesh. Strike drones flooded Nexar orbital platforms. Precision railgun fire cut through station hulls at stress points mapped years earlier. Jamming fields turned their communication grid to static. Firewalls collapsed under AI-guided pressure. Nexar fleets scrambled, tried to reposition, but every movement had been anticipated. They weren't just losing, they were being unraveled. In less than 2 hours, half of the Nexar's defensive capacity was non-functional. Not just destroyed, rendered obsolete. Weapon systems overheated from counter-frequency pulses. Ship reactors shut down after targeted MP waves struck known capacitor junctions. Boarding parties neutralized central command stations with non-lethal force deliberately. Because Hayes didn't want blood. She wanted clarity. Inside the Nexar High Command Chamber, chaos reigned. Tactical displays blinked out. Emergency lights flashed. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Every defense protocol failed. Every safe assumption shattered. Zindar, the cultural specialist, stood still as panic whirled around him. His research tendrils lay motionless, his gaze fixed on a holofeed showing a human strike team landing on Nexar Prime without firing a single shot. "They're not here to destroy us," he whispered. "They're here to teach us." The final 2 hours weren't marked by missiles, but by words. Hayes' holographic presence appeared over the Nexar High Command table. The room fell silent. The humans had hijacked their comm grid, bypassing every encrypted system with practiced ease. Her image flickered, larger than life, her voice calm but unmistakably cold. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said. "We could end your civilization right now. Every planet, every ship, every station, vaporized. 15 minutes. No survivors." The Nexar military lead, Rexivel, visibly trembling, managed to speak. "Then, why haven't you?" "Because," Hayes said evenly, "that's not who we choose to be." That word again. Choice. It had become the centerpiece of humanity's doctrine since the incident began. They hadn't started this war. But once it began, they would decide how it ended. And it would end fast. "We trained for this," Hayes continued, her eyes sweeping the room. "We built for this. We studied your systems for decades, not to attack, but to prepare. You gave us the justification, and now we give you the lesson." The Nexar leadership tried to regroup, tried to bluff, offered negotiations. Hayes didn't flinch. "This isn't a negotiation. This is your education." She transmitted the first of several files directly into their command net, detailed scans of Nexar vessels, annotated with vulnerabilities, design flaws, and failure points. Real-time diagnostic breakdowns of Nexar fleet posture, highlighted predictions of crew response times under psychological duress. "That's 2% of what we know," Hayes said. "We didn't want to use it, but we made sure it existed just in case." She let the silence linger. And then the final line. "Humans don't fight long wars. We fight decisive ones." By Year 6, the war was over. No formal surrender ceremony, no grand military parade. Just a transmission from the Nexar Council, voice subdued, requesting immediate ceasefire and a willingness to comply with human terms. Not because they were defeated in battle, but because they were outmaneuvered before it began. Hayes returned to her quarters, silence settling over the command ship. Rodriguez joined her, datapad in hand. "It's done," he said quietly, the fleet's standing down. No further resistance. Border systems are being handed over for reconstruction. She exhaled slowly and took the datapad. On it were the casualty numbers. Human casualties, 0. Nexar casualties, minimal, contained. Non-lethal. "You told the AI strike teams to avoid fatal shots?" Rodriguez asked. Hayes nodded. "This wasn't about punishment. It was about proof." "Of what?" She looked up, her expression unreadable. "That we could, and chose not to." Across the galaxy, species who had once dismissed humans as naive began rewriting their policies. News feeds flashed with new terms: preemptive defensive doctrine, strategic peace pressure, and, most notably, the human completion principle. It became understood that once war was forced upon Earth, it wouldn't drag on. It would end, and quickly. On the rebuilt New Sydney colony, a monument was placed in the center of the plaza. It bore no weapons, no flags, just a quote from Admiral Hayes, engraved into steel. "We didn't want this war, but once it started, we made sure it ended our way." Years later, in a xenopolitical lecture hall, Professor Hayes stood before a group of mixed-species students. An eager Threxian asked. Why didn't humanity continue the campaign after the Nexar surrendered? Why not use the momentum to dominate? Hayes smiled faintly, because conquest was never the goal. Victory isn't measured by the size of your empire. It's measured by how little damage you had to do to stop the next war. But the war ended so fast, another student said. It didn't even seem real. It was real, Hayes replied. And it ended fast because we were ready. Every system, every protocol, every asset had one purpose: to make sure that when the time came, the answer wouldn't be drawn out. She looked at the class. It would be decisive. The war could have ended with fire, with ash, with the complete erasure of the Nexar from galactic memory. They had given humanity every justification. They bombed unarmed colonies, killed civilians, targeted children. 8 million lives snuffed out in what they called a measured deterrent. And yet, as the Nexar leadership stood broken, their systems in disarray, their fleet on its knees, humanity chose something the galaxy hadn't expected. Restoration. You want us to rebuild them? Raxival's voice wavered as he looked up at the towering hologram of Admiral Catherine Hayes. The transmission flickered inside the battered Nexar High Command Chamber, still dark from system-wide power failures. Hayes didn't blink. No, she said, you don't get to just rebuild them. You're going to help us make them better. The silence in the room was absolute. A stunned stillness descended on the Nexar command team. No demands for territory? Zindar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No occupation? Murmured Tekmora. No, Hayes replied flatly. We're not interested in ruling your space. She leaned forward, and though the transmission was digital, her presence filled the chamber like a thundercloud. You destroyed lives, families, homes, and for that, there must be restitution. Not just apologies, not just words, action. She paused. You're going to send your engineers, your materials, your logistics ships, your laborers, and you're going to work beside our people to rebuild every station, every school, every hospital you turned to rubble. It wasn't vengeance. Tissons. It was accountability. On New Sydney, now nothing but burned metal and broken stone, the first Nexar construction vessels arrived under escort. Their crews were silent, faces grim, unsure of how they'd be received. They found the survivors already clearing rubble, not with weapons drawn but with tools, engineers, volunteers, children planting trees beside scorched craters. A Nexar architect named Tilsharai stepped out of her vessel and walked toward a group of human structural engineers. She expected confrontation. Instead, she was handed a blueprint. This was the original layout, said a young human, smudged with soot. But we were thinking of expanding the medical wing. We'll need your help with the power routing. Tilshari stared at him, stunned. He shrugged. Someone's got to get it done. And your species owes us one hell of a favor. Across the galaxy, the story repeated. Europa Base, once a crater, now being rebuilt with Nexar terraformers. Ganymede Station, its atmospheric rings now stabilized with Nexar tech that had once been proprietary. The work wasn't easy. Tensions simmered. Fights broke out. There were old wounds and fresh ones. But the cooperation held, because it wasn't being asked. It was required. They're learning, Hayes said, standing in the observation bay of a joint Nexar-Terran development site. Rodriguez stood beside her, watching Nexar and human workers weld structural beams together under the harsh floodlights of orbit. They're trying, he agreed. I'll give them that. Hayes said nothing for a while. Then, this is how we win. Not by crushing them, not by dominating them, but by changing them. Rodriguez glanced over. You really think this sticks? That they won't just revert after the heat dies down? They won't forget, she said quietly, because we made them look at what they destroyed and help bring it back. Zindar watched the reconstruction from a Nexar diplomatic transport, now repurposed as a mobile habitat. He sat with other cultural specialists, many of whom had once written entire theses about human pacifism. Have you ever seen a species respond this way? One asked him. No, Zindar said. They didn't respond with conquest. They responded with terms. And the terms were labor? Zindar shook his head. Not labor. Responsibility. Back on Earth, debates raged. There were those who wanted revenge, who demanded orbital bombardment in return for what the Nexar had done, who said that letting them live was weakness. But those voices were drowned out not by pacifists, but by survivors, mothers, teachers, doctors. People who'd lost everything and still showed up at the rebuild sites with tools in hand and purpose in their hearts. One such woman, Dr. Elena Wu, who had lost both her children on Ganymede Station, was asked on a broadcast if she supported the reconstruction plan. Her answer was clear. Yes, I do, because I want the ones who did this to walk the halls they once shattered. To see the children laugh where they once screamed. To know that we rose from the ashes with their help. And every time they step on that rebuilt ground, they'll remember humanity gave them the chance to be better. That was the victory. Not the surrender, not the broken fleet, not even the strategic dominance. It was the fact that humanity didn't burn it all down even though they could have. The Nexar learned fast. At first, the labor was mechanical tasks performed under duress. But soon, something changed. Their engineers began asking questions, making suggestions, designing improvements. In time, the rebuilt colonies weren't just restored, they were transformed. More resilient, more efficient, more beautiful. Hybrid architecture emerged, sleek Nexar curves blending with Earth's brutalist foundations. Atmospheric processors redesigned by joint committees. Defense systems calibrated not for war, but for protection. Even the children noticed. In New Sydney's new education complex, now powered by Nexar renewable grids, students of both species learned side by side. One mural in the school's main corridor showed a human hand gripping a Nexar frill, steady, firm, but not violent. Beneath it, a phrase in both languages. We rebuild, together, so we never destroy again. When the final reconstruction phase ended, Hayes stood before the Galactic Council, flanked by both human and Nexar representatives. A delegate from the Shallot Consortium asked the question everyone had been waiting for. Why didn't you punish them? Why not extract tribute, enforce dominance? Hayes answered with the same quiet certainty she'd carried since the war began. Because punishment ends with fear, but rebuilding that leaves a legacy. Later, Zindar gave a lecture at the rebuilt Europa base. The humans, he said to his class, are not just warriors. They are architects of consequence. He gestured to the massive atrium above him, co-designed by a human artist and a Nexar mathematician. Every beam you see here, every corridor, every reinforced wall, all of it was built by the hands of those who once called each other enemies. He let the silence speak for itself. And that is why, he concluded, the dragons don't always breathe fire. Sometimes they hand you the bricks and make sure you help build the future.